You ever have one of those moments in life where everything feels like it's finally coming together? Like you survived all the storms, all the heartbreaks, and now things finally make sense? I ever thought that was me. The night before my wedding, my name's Claire. I was 29, engaged to the kindest man I'd ever met, and I thought, truly thought, my life was about to start fresh. We had a small ceremony planned, nothing too crazy. Just close friends, a few relatives, and a little house by the lake we rented for the weekend. Everyone kept saying how lucky I was. And you know what? I believed it. I believed my parents were proud of me too. That was my first mistake. Growing up, my parents were complicated. From the outside, we looked perfect. Big house, Sunday church, family dinners with matching napkins. You know the type. But behind closed doors, my parents were obsessed with control. My dad always cared about what people thought. He'd say things like, Claire, we don't talk about family issues in public, or keep your emotions in check. People are watching. My mom wasn't much better. She was beautiful, smart, and terrifying. Her favorite phrase was, You owe us everything, Claire. Don't forget who raised you. It sounds like drama now, but as a kid, I thought it was normal. I thought parents were supposed to make you feel small just to keep you humble. When I met Ethan, my fiance, it was like a breath of air I didn't know I'd been missing. He made me laugh. He didn't care about appearances or whose last name meant what. He cared about how I felt, and that's probably why my parents hated him. They never said it outright, but I saw it in their eyes. That flicker of disapproval every time he spoke up for me, or when he encouraged me to make my own choices. They smiled for photos, but behind that, I could sense something brewing, quiet resentment. Still, I didn't want to believe my parents were that cruel, not until that night. We had a small family dinner before the wedding. It was supposed to be simple. My parents, a few cousins, Ethan, and me. Laughter, candles, a few toasts. I remember my mom pouring the wine herself. She was unusually sweet that night, complimenting my dress, saying how proud she was. Even my dad smiled in a way that almost felt genuine. I should have known that was the warning sign. Halfway through dinner, I started to feel dizzy. My head was light, my arms heavy. I laughed it off, saying, Guess I am more nervous than I thought. Everyone chuckled. Everyone except my mom. She just smiled and said, Don't worry, honey, and you'll feel better soon. The room began to blur. My father's voice became distant. Then, nothing. When I woke up, I thought I was in the wrong body. My head felt cold, my throat was dry, the sheet smelled like disinfectant. I reached up to move my hair out of my face, but there was no hair, just skin. I remember my heart racing, pounding so loud I could hear it. I stumbled to the mirror, and froze. My head was shaved, completely uneven, patches of hair left in random spots like someone had done it in the dark. For a moment, I couldn't even scream. I just stood there, staring at the stranger in the reflection. Then the door creaked open, and there they were, my parents. My mom's voice was so calm, it made me sick. She said, Oh, good, you're awake. Don't freak out, sweetheart. It's just hair. You were too anxious last night, so we helped you calm down. Helped me. Helped me. I looked at her, tears blurring my vision, and whispered, What did you do to me? She crossed her arms and said, You were out of control. You were going to embarrass us tomorrow. We couldn't let that happen. I turned to my dad, hoping he'd stop her, but he just looked away. No emotion, no guilt, just cold silence. In that moment, something inside me broke, not just from the humiliation, but from the realization that my parents didn't love me. They loved control. They drugged me. They humiliated me, and they expected me to thank them for it. I ran, didn't even grab my phone, just threw on a jacket, took the car keys, and drove. I don't remember most of that drive, only that my vision was blurry and my heart wouldn't stop pounding. I pulled over at a rest stop hours later, stared at myself in the rearview mirror, and thought they wanted to break me. They wanted me to cancel the wedding, hide in shame, and that's when the first thought of revenge crossed my mind. Not the movie kind, not fire or fury. No, I wanted them to see what they'd done, to feel the weight of their So I made a decision. I wasn't going to hide. I was going to show up to my wedding exactly as I was, bald, bruised, and unbroken. That next morning, Ethan was panicking. He'd called a dozen times. I finally answered. Claire, where are you? Your parents said you got cold feet. I took a deep breath and said, Don't listen to anything they told you. I'm coming. When I arrived at the venue, people stared. Some gasped, a few even whispered. My mom's face went pale the second she saw me. She walked toward me, hissing under her breath. Go home, Claire. You're making a scene, I smiled. That's the idea. I walked past her and straight to Ethan. His eyes widened, and for a second I thought he'd faint. But then he just wrapped his arms around me and whispered, We don't have to do this today. I shook my head. We do. But not the way they planned. So we did. We stood in front of our friends, the people who mattered, and I told the truth. I told them what happened the night before. Every word, every ugly detail, the gasps, the silence, the way my mother's fake smile cracked like glass. You could feel the air change in that room. My dad tried to interrupt, saying, She's exaggerating, And that's when I showed them the bruise on my arm. Ethan's mom started crying. My friend stood up in disbelief. The photographer lowered his camera. It was chaos. Beautiful, necessary chaos. After that day, my parents' masks started to fall apart. Word spread. My aunt stopped talking to them. The local church quietly removed my father from the committee. Their perfect family reputation, gone. But I wasn't done yet, because humiliation wasn't enough. They needed to understand why what they did was evil. They needed to feel powerless, just like they made me feel. That's when my revenge truly began. After the wedding, the real one I chose with people who had my back, I felt lighter in a way I hadn't expected. Not because my hair had changed or because the ceremony looked different, because I stopped pretending. For the first time, I stopped performing for them. I stopped apologizing for breathing. But the relief was only the beginning. If I wanted this to actually matter, to stop them from doing this to anyone else, I had to be smart. I had to be surgical. I couldn't let anger be my plan. Anger is loud, messy, and makes you sloppy. Strategy is quiet, steady, and it doesn't need fireworks to land the punch. So I made a list, a boring list, like a grown-up's revenge blueprint. 1. Document everything. 2. Find witnesses. 3. Use their values against them. 4. Make it public in a way that mattered. 5. Keep my dignity while doing it. Sounds methodical, right? That's the point. Humiliation thrives on theatrics. Accountability thrives on paperwork. I started with documentation because you can't convince a community with feelings alone. You need a paper trail. I pulled up my phone and went back through messages, calls, photos, anything that showed pattern. There were old texts from when my mother guilt-tripped me into canceling college semesters. There were voicemails where my dad lectured me for hours about keeping the family name. I saved screenshots, backed them up to the cloud, emailed copies to myself, and printed the most damning ones. I also made a list of people who knew, not just who had seen the incident, but who had seen the pattern. Cousins who'd been sidelined, former neighbors who'd been lectured into silence, the old family friend who'd once told me privately that my mother's help leaned a little too far into control. I called them one by one and told them exactly what I needed, their story in their words written down. This part felt like asking for favors from strangers. It felt like begging for truth. But people responded. Some were scared to sign their names. Some typed a paragraph and hung up. One aunt refused to believe it, said I was making mountains. But 3 people gave me detailed statements. Jane, my cousin, wrote an email that started, I remember the night Claire was 17, and then listed years of comments and incidents that suddenly made the pattern obvious. It hurt to read because it was a map of how they'd shaped me into someone small. I also went to my doctor. I showed the bruise on my arm and explained what happened. She wrote notes and an official record. I got a copy. It felt strange and good to have a medical person simply put words on paper that said, This is harm. This is not a joke. At the same time, I wasn't going to create drama on social media. I'd seen people scream into the void online and watch it combust into noise. This had to be targeted. It had to be relevant. So I thought about what my parents valued most. It wasn't love. It wasn't family. It was reputation. It was the charity they'd started 10 years ago that was now a proud little pillar in our community. It was the board of that charity. It was the local church they led fundraising for. It was the people who donated money because they trusted my parents' name. If your power comes from public trust, then let public trust be the thing that challenges you. I wrote to one of the board members, a woman named Harriet I'd known since I was a kid. I didn't send a rant. I sent a clean, precise email. Here's what happened. Here are copies of messages. Here are names of witnesses who will speak. It wasn't dramatic. It was undeniable. I asked one question at the end. How would you advise the board to respond if these things are true? The reaction was slow. That's key. If you want leverage, you don't slam the door. You open the lock quietly and let the mechanism do the work. A couple of days later, Harriet called me. She sounded like someone who'd swallowed a lemon, the polite, careful tone of someone considering whether to burn a bridge that's been carrying them for years. We'll have to discuss this, she said. This concerns our donors and our mission. A week later, another knock. An old reporter who'd written about my parents' charity reached out asking to verify a timeline. He had a gentle professional curiosity and a list of questions that made me realize the story was moving from my living room into the public square. Meanwhile, I kept doing the small, quiet things that are the scaffolding of bigger moves. I organized the witnesses' statements into a timeline. I highlighted messages that showed clear intent, the words that suggested premeditation, not just a mistake. I made copies and put one in a manila folder I carried with me like armor. There were nights I'd lie awake and feel panic bob up like a bubble. Would this ruin them? Would people hate me for going public? Would I be painting myself as the villain in their church newsletters? I allowed myself a few wild fantasies. Them losing everything. Them finally seeing what it felt like to be small. But I kept the fantasies to myself. The work was steadier. I believed that consequences could be fair without being cruel. I also learned how to talk without sounding like a victim. People shut down at tears or explode at fury. I practiced telling my story in a way that made people ask questions. This is what happened. These are the facts. What would you do if someone you trusted did this? You direct the room to think about the ethical problem instead of grabbing for the emotional lever. People who are morally decent almost always respond to a well-laid-out set of facts. At one point, my father tried to call me. He left a voicemail that was equal parts pleading and performance. Claire, I'm so sorry you're upset. We were only trying to protect you. You could imagine the camera on his face, the way he'd practice contrition in the mirror. My stomach turned. I knew better than to take the bait. If I'd been on stage, this was the moment he was trying for applause. I saved the voicemail, of course. Records are trophies in this game. The day the board of the charity asked my parents to the meeting felt like the day a trial lawyer slides a file across a table. There were people there I barely knew, sitting in a room with the air conditioning humming, volunteers in their mid-60s who had written checks because someone told them to. When my parents walked in, their faces were still polished, but you could see the micro expressions, the flicker of panic that slipped through their practiced mask. I didn't go to the first meeting as a theatrical entrance. I sat in the back and let the board lead. I watched my mother explain, in her rehearsed voice, that it was a misunderstanding, that our family had complicated dynamics, that I wasn't thinking clearly. She tried to make it sound like a storm you get through with careful prayers, but the board had questions, real board-like questions. Were there witnesses? Was there medical evidence? Where were the dates? The board members wanted to know if donors could trust the organization, not because they were cold, but because trust mattered to their work. That's the hook I used. When you pull on what people care about, you don't have to be loud to yank them in. One board member, a woman who ran 3 clinics in the state, asked if the charity leadership recognized the harm done and if they were willing to step aside while this was investigated. My parents balked. You could see the math behind their faces. If they step aside, they lose the platform. If they stay, they risk being forced out later. They'd always use their platform as a shield. Suddenly, the shield had a crack. After that meeting, things accelerated. The local pastor called for a soft review. A few donors paused their contributions. People started whispering in the back pews. It was surreal to watch the thing that had protected them, their public work, become the mechanism that could remove that protection. I'll admit, I liked watching them look uncomfortable, but I never wanted to humiliate them in front of the kids or the elderly who had nothing to do with this. My target was the systems they'd weaponized. Strip the facade, hand the truth to the infrastructure they relied on, and let that infrastructure react. The more I pulled, the more their allies tried to steady the ship. My mother hired a PR person. My father spoke at a community dinner and gave a speech that looked like a prayer, but felt like damage control. They started circulating a narrative. A family dispute blown out of proportion. Classic. Blame the whistleblower. Protect the saintly image. But the difference now was that the narrative had to stand up under scrutiny. I had receipts. I had witnesses. I had a doctor's note. Those things matter more than eloquence. I also had an unexpected ally, Ethan's mother. She wasn't a crusader by nature, but she had seen her son stand by me in the worst moment, and that changed her calculus. She called board members and said quietly, "If this is true, I don't want to be associated with a group that covers this." She had influence with people who wrote checks. Influence still matters. There was a specific moment that felt like a hinge. My mother had been scheduled to speak at a donor luncheon, something she loved, where she could stand and be admired while they served tiny sandwiches. I wrote a short, factual letter and sent it to one of the main donors. I didn't use incendiary language. I simply said, "I wanted to make you aware of recent allegations. If you'd like to discuss this in private, I can provide documents that donor called the charity." Someone at the luncheon asked for clarification. My mother tried to speak in platitudes. Someone in the back asked to see the documents. The meeting turned from adoration to accounting in one question. They started to tremble, not because they were caught in the alley, but because the ground they stood on, the support of community institutions, was shifting. A friend asked me once, stunned, "Were you ever scared you'd go too far?" Of course, I worried I'd fling a grenade and watch my family's life explode beyond repair, but I kept picturing the woman in the mirror the morning my head was shaved. Small, betrayed, stunned. I wanted her back. I wanted a world where a parent couldn't weaponize a child's trust for image protection. That felt worth the risk. I also wanted them to see what I felt. That might sound petty, but there's a difference between cruelty that you can swallow and cruelty that has consequences. People who use shame as a tool rarely face it. They push, and the world covers for them. I wanted the cover removed so the consequences would teach a lesson that shame cannot. We arranged a mediated meeting eventually. That was another strategic move. Mediation creates a record. It requires people to say things in front of a neutral third party. It also gives institutions a chance to make a formal request, step down temporarily, submit to review, whatever it takes. I walked into that room with a folder and nothing else. My hands were steady. My parents showed up as if they were walking into a play stacked with applause. Their faces were masks that had been perfected over decades of community theater. The mediator, an older man experienced with family conflicts, and asked the basic questions. What happened that night? What outcome do you want? I could have screamed. I could have told every secret and made them pay in full. Instead, I spoke clear sentences. "I want accountability," I said. "I want them to recognize the harm and for the organization to ensure this can't happen again to another person." That simple sentence startled them more than any dramatic accusation would have. It shifted the conversation from blame to remediation. It forced them into a corner where moral language had to be matched with action. There were moments of gaslighting. My mother tried the classic, "We were protecting you." My father tried to minimize. It wasn't meant to be permanent. The mediator asked them to be specific, to explain why they felt the need to drug their daughter. My mother faltered. Words felt thin in her mouth. You could see the rehearsal crumble. After the mediation, the charity board issued a request. Temporary leave while they investigated. Donors paused. The pastor scheduled a conversation with the congregation. My parents' world of curated reputation started to look like a stage with the lights turned on. Suddenly, everything that had been hidden was visible. I didn't dance on their failure. I didn't post triumphant videos. I kept showing up to meetings. I answered questions calmly. Sometimes the hardest part was being unreadable. People like spectacle. They want dramatic scenes. I learned to be boring and meticulous. Those qualities were lethal in their own way. There were low moments. My cousins split down the middle. Some called me a liar. A few of my childhood friends stopped talking. It hurts when people choose the monster you grew up with over you. But most people didn't want to pick a side without the facts. That is why the facts mattered. And then something happened that I didn't expect. My parents cracked in private in a way that wasn't performance. Not long after the board meeting, where they were asked to step aside, my father came to my house late at night. He knocked like a man who had been rehearsing lines and was suddenly afraid he'd forget them. We talked for hours. He didn't apologize in polished speeches. He said, haltingly, "I thought I was protecting you. I thought letting people think highly of us was helping you have a better life." His voice was small, not the commanding tone that had ruled my childhood, but a frightened tremor. I listened. I didn't want his confession as currency. I wanted it as truth. It was messy. It was human. He cried, which is something I never saw him do when I was small. I don't know if that was authentic or another adaptation, but I kept my guard anyway. I told him what it felt like to wake up in the morning, image of myself altered, betrayed by the person who should have kept me safe. He said, "I didn't know." That sentence was both an admission and a shield. I forgave in stages. That's important to understand. Forgiveness in real life isn't a single act. It's a process. I told him I wanted to see real change. I wanted them to volunteer at the charity under supervision, to take counseling, to meet with the families they'd harmed and listen. I wanted transparency. I wanted them to stop controlling narratives for their comfort. He agreed, none of it sounding particularly enthusiastic. But he agreed. Public consequence had become private willingness, or at least private concession. The charity issued a statement that was careful, legal, and yet it acknowledged, in the way institutions sometimes do, that harm had occurred and the leadership would step back pending review. That statement was not my victory. It was the system doing what systems do when presented with evidence. And again, the thing I wanted most wasn't to make them suffer for the rest of their lives. It was to make sure no one else ever woke up in a motel bathroom with someone's scissors beside them. I wanted policies. I wanted oversight. I wanted talk turned into action. So the final part of my plan was structural. I worked with the board to write new safeguarding policies for volunteers and staff. I pushed for mandatory training about boundaries and consent. I asked for a hotline where people could report abuse without fear. I asked for an external consultant to audit the organization's culture. These changes would not make headlines like a scandal, but they would make it harder for any parent or leader to weaponize trust ever again. When you're trying to fix harm, you don't necessarily seek revenge in the way movies show you. You seek prevention, you build guardrails. That is a quieter, stickier form of justice. It's slow, doesn't make for sensational headlines, and it actually protects people. There were moments when I felt guilty for wanting anything beyond a clean break. Some nights I wondered if I should have simply walked away and rebuilt my life in quiet. But whenever I thought about that, I remembered waking up in that mirror and feeling the absolute smallness of fear. The memory kept me steady. In the end, my parents were asked to step down from public roles. They agreed to counseling and to participate in oversight. The board implemented new policies. Some donors returned, but many didn't. The charity changed. It was neither perfect nor complete, but it was different, and my parents started to tremble in a new way, not with the shaky fear of being exposed, though that was part of it, but with the quiet human discomfort of accountability. They had to sit in rooms and hear people describe pain. They had to answer questions without the buffer of performance. They had to do the small, humiliating work of listening. If revenge is a single glorious moment, then this probably sounds unsatisfying. But the thing about causing real change is that it's rarely dramatic. It's 1,000 tiny cuts to the systems that protect abusers. It's the removal of applause. It's the slow realization that no one is above the rules they created for others. I won't romanticize this. It was painful. It cost relationships. It cost my childhood illusions. But it stopped their ability to cloak cruelty in charity. And that mattered more than a scream into a microphone. Some people will ask, did I forgive them? Did I help them back into society? My answer is complicated. I didn't forget. I didn't excuse. I set boundaries. I demanded real work. There were private moments. My mother dropping to her knees once in the middle of a volunteer shift, shaking, repeating, I'm sorry, without script. There were times he'd sit in a circle and listen while someone he judged told a story of humiliation. Those are not cinematic redemptions. They're awkward, sometimes sincere attempts at not being the same person again. Change is a ragged thing. That's where I'll stop for now. Act 3 is the resolution. The moment the dust settles, the choices I make about mercy versus retribution, and how life looks when you try to rebuild. There are weddings again, but different ones. There is a new peace, not because old harm disappears, but because systems change and because I learned I had a voice that did not need permission. The morning sun felt different that day, softer, quieter, almost apologetic. Maybe because I finally slept through the night for the first time in months. It had been 3 weeks since my parents' perfect world started to crumble. 3 weeks since they realized their daughter wasn't the fragile doll they could control. But this story, my story, didn't end with their humiliation. Because revenge, I've learned, isn't about payback. It's about power. Taking back what someone tried to steal from you. And I was about to show them exactly what that looked like. Oho, wo nastar dag stenk. The morning started ordinary enough. I was sitting by the window of my new apartment, hair just beginning to grow back. Little soft patches that made me look like a dandelion that refused to die. Coffee in one hand, my phone in the other. Then a message came through, from Dad, greater than, your mother isn't doing well, she's been crying, maybe it's time you stop this, stop this. As if speaking the truth was a crime. I could have ignored it, but instead I took a deep breath and typed back, greater than I'll stop when you admit what you did. 10 minutes later, another message popped up, and this time from my mom. Her words were sharp, clipped, defensive, greater than, we were trying to protect you. You've embarrassed us enough. Don't push us further. That last line, don't push us further. It made me laugh. The kind of laugh that comes from pain so deep it circles back to power. You see, what they didn't know was that I'd been documenting everything since the night it happened. Messages, voice recordings, hospital reports, even the apology they tried to fake for the family WhatsApp group. I had receipts. And when you've been silenced your whole life, evidence becomes your megaphone. So I made a choice. I wasn't going to fight them in private anymore. I was going to speak publicly, calmly, honestly, and let people decide for themselves. I opened my laptop, logged into Facebook, and started typing. Greater than some people say parents always know best. Mine once drugged me and shaved my head the night before my wedding to protect me from embarrassing them. They said it was love. I call it control. I added a photo, that same one from the wedding day, bald and bruised but smiling anyway. Then I clicked post, and just like that, the silence that had defined my childhood broke. The comments started within minutes. Shock, support, anger. Old neighbors messaged me privately, saying they'd always suspected something was wrong. Former church members apologized for believing my parents' lies. By evening, the post had been shared over 1,000 times. I didn't post it to go viral. I posted it because I wanted my voice back. But what I didn't expect was how loud that voice would become. That night, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was my father. He sounded different, not angry, he's scared. He said, Claire, people are talking. Your mother hasn't stopped crying. Take it down before you destroy us. And for the first time in my life, I didn't hesitate. I said, you destroyed yourselves the night you decided to drug your daughter. And I hung up. The next morning, there was a knock at my door. I opened it, and there they were, my parents. They looked smaller. My father's shoulders were slumped. My mother's eyes were swollen. It was strange seeing the two people who used to terrify me standing there like lost children. My mom tried to speak, but her voice cracked. She said, please, Claire. Everyone's turned on us. We've lost everything. I stepped aside, letting them in. My hands were shaking, but my voice wasn't. Good, I said. Now you finally know what it feels like. We sat in silence for a long moment, the same silence I'd lived in for years. Only this time, it didn't scare me. My dad finally said, we just wanted to protect our family name. And I looked him straight in the eye and said, you were never protecting me. You were protecting your pride. He had no answer, just a blank stare. For once, I could see it, the tremble in his hands. My mom reached for my arm, whispering, "You've ruined us, Claire." I gently pulled away and said, "No, Mom. I freed myself." They left without another word, but that look on their faces, that the fear, the realization that they'd lost control forever, it told me everything. They finally felt what I had felt that night, powerless, and that was the moment they truly trembled. Weeks later, I started therapy. I went back to school. I even began helping others who'd experienced family abuse. People who, like me, were told their pain was just love. And if there's one thing I learned, it's this: you don't always have to destroy your enemies. Sometimes the loudest revenge is living your truth so boldly that it shatters their lies. Text, text, I still keep that photo from my wedding day framed on my desk. Bald head, bruised heart, and the faintest smile, because that was the day I met the real me. Not the daughter they controlled, not the girl they silenced, but the woman who finally took her life back. If you've ever been made to feel small by family, by friends, by anyone who thought they owned your choices, I want you to hear this. You don't owe them your silence. You owe yourself peace. And if my story hit you somewhere deep, hey, maybe stick around. There's more where this came from. Hit subscribe, drop a comment, and tell me what you would have done that night. Because trust me, revenge doesn't always look like fire. Sometimes it just looks like peace and the courage to keep your head high, even when it's shaved.